Welcome everyone to this is the last of our research seminar series and the third of our special AAD Books this year. For some time we've been in discussion with our long-time teacher, unit tutor, Pierre and friend, about the launch of his book, his epic book, Dwelling on the Future, which we're about to hear about in more detail. And I'm very, very pleased to be able to conclude our books session for this year. Yeah, just a reminder, switch your microphone off if you're if you're not speaking. It always happens when people arrive, they don't have their microphones off yet. Okay, so the format for this evening is that Pierre is going to open with some reflections on his book, Dwelling on the Future, Architecture for the Seaside, Middle England and the Metropolis. And he will, towards the end of his talk, Georgia Hablützel will speak as well about her involvement in the book. And then we're very lucky this evening to have three interlocutors who will, if you like, expand the conversation about the book. Dean Hawkes has kindly stepped in at a late stage to replace Andrew Hulton, who can't be here, but it's great to see Dean. We all, of course, know Dean, and many of us have known him for a very long time indeed, and he will respond to the presentation. Gleb Sobolov, a long-time collaborator of Pierre's, will also speak, and Jos Bosman will respond as well. I'll call upon them in turn to speak and I'll moderate that conversation. But each of them will then give a brief introduction to who they are at that time. So what we're going to do is jump straight in with Pierre. I just wanted to say a few words about Pierre. I first met Pierre many, many years ago when he was teaching at the University of Cambridge. I wasn't taught directly by him, but attended lectures that he gave. He's an architect and teacher based in London, of course. He set up Pierre Davoine Architects in 1979, and more recently had a studio with his daughter Pierre and with Nilesh Shah from 2017. He practices and teaches and exhibits internationally and has written in a variety of publications. He has been teaching the Master of Architecture Unit 14 at the School of Art, Architecture and Design at London Met for a number of years, and has also taught at Bath School of Architecture, at the AA and at Cambridge. He's been visiting professor at the Welsh School of Architecture and at the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts in Copenhagen. This book he's talking about this evening is really a very different kind of book in terms of its form as well as its content. So I think we're all looking forward to hearing more from Pierre. Over to you, Pierre. So if you'd like to unmute yourself and...
I've unmuted.
There you go.
Sorry about that. I need to go full screen. Yeah.
You are full screen, Pierre.
I am full screen.
Yes.
And my presentation, is that up on screen?
Try and go full screen again, and it might be that it gets larger because we have a white stripe at the side. If you go to the view button.
Yeah. No. Hold on. Does that come up? Can you see
better? That? Yeah, now you're full screen. Okay.
Lovely, thank you. Well, Matthew, thank you very much for inviting me, along with Nick Temple and Christian Frost, and Hannah Parr for helping get this event together. It's great to be here, and you know, it's a pleasure to join you and see so many friends and colleagues also joining in online. I mean, I'm sure people say this, but it is really a genuine regret that we can't all be together and meet and celebrate the launch of the book face to face in person. You know, It is a real pleasure, regret. But this is the cover of the book as published by UCL Press. And I'll come more to that, obviously, in due course. I mean, this is the sort of running order which Matthew has just gone through. I'm not sure, this might change. Matthew might invite Dean to speak before Gleb and Jos. I'm not sure how he's planned this. And I've kind of decided to really title this presentation. I've said one thing leads to another, and it's a presentation by me, and it's also a presentation with my colleague Georgia Hablützel, who was very much involved in the process of making the book. So I say launch because there was a launch held previously at the TU Eindhoven in the autumn of 2019 at the invitation of Professor Jos Bosman, and Jos will be speaking later, and also Sergio Figueiredo, who took over from Jos as the curator of the exhibitions at Eindhoven. The book has taken a very long time to get ready for publication. For me, it still isn't finished satisfactorily, and I suspect it's not untypical that a launch may be anticipated prematurely in a spirit of optimism. At TU Eindhoven, the book that we presented was a dummy version we had designed and put together in my office over a period of 4 years. Jos had mounted an exhibition in the extensive School of Architecture foyer. I visited for the finissage and presented Dwelling on the Future in public for the first time. I spoke of my aims in making the book, its content, as well as the book itself as an artifact, the material outcome of research and study. Prior to the TU Eindhoven exhibition in 2018, Gleb invited us to exhibit and lecture on aspects of the book at the Dostoevsky Library in Moscow. Gleb reviewed the book for Construction Expert Journal Moscow, and he'll also be speaking, as Matthew said, later. So to start with, however, I think it may be helpful to talk about the gestation of the book. Dwelling on the Future has evolved from a long-standing interest in the design of houses explored in an earlier book, Housey Housey, a pattern book of ideal homes, which Claire Melchior and I published in 2005. In that book, we explored the idea of a contemporary pattern book. The projects included 23 houses designed by my office, which we categorized according to location, type, condition, and material. We proposed a bottom-up approach to housing that does not preclude larger scale development, but challenges the hegemony of the volume house builders and advocates for new government legislation to be formulated and implemented to enable individuals and small groups to obtain land at affordable costs on which to build homes for themselves without being priced out of the market. We attempted to discuss the conditions which govern house building, and the designs were offered as opportunities for new approaches to contemporary lifestyles and the aspirations of an increasingly diverse population. The book title, interestingly enough, came from an exhibition I was invited to hold in 2001 to inaugurate London Met's new Springhouse Gallery, when the architecture school was still on the Holloway Road. We also launched the book Housey Housey at Springhouse in 2005. The original launch date was autumn 2004, which was to coincide with a lecture and an exhibition that we held at the RIBA. But sadly, the book wasn't ready in time. The exhibition at the RIBA included dolls' houses made by students in David Grandorge's M-Arch unit at London Met. These were based on house patterns from the book, adapted to second-hand tables which David and I had bought at Brick Lane Market. Peter Julian Mortensen, professor and head at the Institute of Planning at the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts, Copenhagen, approached me in 2008. He declared a great interest in our Housey Housey book. He invited me to be a guest professor there in 2009 and wanted to initiate this by mounting the Housey Housey exhibition. I was sharing an office with Andrew Holton at the time and invited Andrew and Claire Melchior to join me in presenting an exhibition there. We had visited the school in Copenhagen and realized that the Housey Housey exhibition would be far too small for their exhibition gallery. We invented a new installation titled Land Architecture People, an exhibition by the architects Pierre and Andrew Holton and anthropologist Clement Hewish. As Matthew has said, sadly, Andrew, who is going to speak about the book this evening, can't join the book launch owing to unexpected family commitments. He sends his apologies, and I'm hugely grateful to Dean for stepping in at the last moment. An important element of the exhibition in Copenhagen was the inclusion of 10 interviews by Claire with my clients. These were presented as unexpurgated texts alongside photographic portraits of each client. The aim of the interviews was to communicate directly that the architectural project is an inclusive process that is necessarily contingent on external conditions, and that the outcome is dependent on the interaction between a range of protagonists. The Danish audience commented that the presentation of the interviews as an integral part of Land Architecture People was a brave and valuable contribution to the exhibition itself and to the wider discourse about the nature of the way that architecture can be communicated, explained and understood as process as well as outcome. The interviews existed as part of the wider exhibition, which included large models and a deliberately messy display of drawings, sketches, maquettes, publications, other texts and projects we'd brought to Copenhagen from London, all laid out on a low 30-meter long table. Land Architecture People was subsequently held at the Ambika P3 Gallery, University of Westminster in 2010 at the invitation of Murray Fraser, then director of the M-Arch course, and Kate Heron, then head of school and curator of the gallery. It was an amazing invitation. The previous exhibition was by Yanis Kounelis, and Land Architecture People was followed by the Happiest Man, an installation by Ilya and Emilia Kabakov. The Ambika P3 Gallery is a vast 1,400 square meter black box space converted from the 3-story basement concrete testing workshop at Westminster University. It was an opportunity to reinvent the exhibition, to use the cavernous volume and include film and sound projection of the interview recordings. This is a close-up which includes my son Claude. So Murray was also co-editor of the Design Research in Architecture series, together with Jonathan Hill, Jane Rendell and Teddy Cruz. Claire and I were invited to contribute a book to the series, then published by New Ashgate. The series is an outlet for work of design research PhD students at the Bartlett and the occasional practitioner. Claire and I signed a contract with New Ashgate in November 2011, 10 years ago, for a book titled Dwelling on the Future, New Models for Housing, Land Use and the Conditions for Contemporary Architectural Production. In our synopsis, we stated the aim of this book is to draw together in a coherent volume of writings, drawings and photographs a set of research interests which have emerged through the author's written and design work over the last decade. In describing our research context, we stated that the intention of our collaborative work over time has been to forward an understanding of architecture as an expression of social relations, embedded and embodied in material form and context. Accessibility to land represents a fundamental dimension of social relations as they are mapped onto the physical environment. For anthropologists working in the context of traditional societies, land or property tenure represents one of the key areas of social inquiry, fundamental to an understanding of social organization and relationships. In the modern context of complex urban societies, national planning systems may be understood as one of the most explicit forms of social representation, and yet the planning and development framework and the land ownership system on which it is based is mostly accepted as a given. Critical to our thinking about designing and building houses has been an anthropologically informed interest in placemaking and shelter, focused on the relationship between the individual and the community. Cedric Price once said, "Technology is the answer." Now, what was the question? We respond citing Mostafavi and Leatherbarrow, who stated that technology is not essentially a matter of devices or machines, but the knowledge that exists in advance of something coming forth, serving in part as its agency. We have an understanding that it is an act of anticipation. I think it's important to mention that the book has been worked on without any academic funding support, except for an £800 sum provided by the Bartlett in 2012 to pay an assistant to make some new drawings. There has been an immense amount of paid and volunteer contributions over the years, and as a result, progress has been at snail's pace during the first few years as the recession took its toll on practice and academia. Claire was obliged to withdraw from the book in 2015 due to the pressure of other projects. With encouragement and support from Murray and Jonathan, I decided to continue on my own. However, the scope of the book changed considerably and over time. I reinvented the book as an assemblage and gave it a new title, Dwelling on the Future, then the Seaside, Middle England and the Metropolis, and began work on it in earnest in 2016. I had a brilliant group of collaborators, Anna Nicolescu and Sebastian Chu in 2016-17, Georgia Hablützel 2017-18, Amy Glover 2018 to 2020, all of whom were year-out students from the AA who were interested in joining me in the process of making the book and in a conversation about housing. Ryan McStay was also involved over this period, working with me in the office after spending 2 years in Unit 14 London Met, which I taught with Colette Shedick and Perrine Davoine. Several of our ex-London Met students and others made significant contributions to the redrawing of projects in the book, and Brian E. Henson, also an ex-student, made excellent transcriptions of all the interviews. I'm happy that Claire had time to contribute the foreword in pure medium. By changing the title of the book to the more ambiguous Dwelling on the Future, the Seaside, Middle England and the Metropolis, I feel I have been able to take a more discursive, playful approach. To quote James Clifford in The Predicament of Culture, 20th Century Ethnography, Literature and Art, published in 1988, I only read it in the noughties. Ultimately, my topic is a pervasive condition of off-centeredness in a world of distinct meaning systems, a state of being in culture while looking at culture, a form of personal and collective self-fashioning. This predicament responds to the 20th century's unprecedented overlay of traditions. A modern ethnography of conjectures constantly moving between cultures does not, like its Western alter ego, anthropology, aspire to survey the full range of human diversity or development. It is perpetually displaced, both regionally focused and broadly comparative, a form both of dwelling and of travel, where the two experiences are less and less distinct. Part of the presentation, I'll show some plates from the book. This is a map of the projects. The trajectory of the projects in the book, as seen on this map, show them as a non-linear sequence from the seaside towns of Aberystwyth and Weston-super-Mare in the west, crisscrossing the varied landscape of Middle England. This is Aberystwyth Arts Centre. There's Crocombe Court in Somerset. We did a counter proposal for the town of Belper in Derbyshire, 60 houses in a village, Horsmondon in Kent, a proposal for housing at Swaveling, which is in the environs of Eastleigh in Hampshire. And incidentally, Alex Ely was chair of the RIBA jury and we were on a short list for this project. And House plus garden plus house. This is about densification of back gardens in London suburbia, and this is the Pembury Octagon. Each project was presented as an architectural or landscape design and may be studied and hopefully enjoyed and read in depth. The projects have been mostly redrawn using line drawings almost exclusively, with the exception of Bodo Noyce's atmospheric rendering of Crocombe Court, which I haven't shown. The projects are introduced with short text and 4 historical location maps, which enable one to immediately see the way the land has changed since the late 19th century, I beg your pardon. I took over the role of interviewer from Claire and changed the emphasis to one of personal identity, asking each interviewer to talk about their background as well as their involvement in the process. Interviews were mostly in the interviewee's home or office. Some were held in my office, 2 in cafes, one online. I travelled to Manchester to interview Tom Bloxham, chairman of Urban Splash, to discuss the Burnbeck Island competition held by Urban Splash, in which we were runner-up. It was a Friday afternoon. The traffic on the M6 was bad. By the time I arrived, Tom had left to spend the weekend at his villa on the Riviera. Sadly, I didn't have the opportunity to include an interview with Tom in the book. These are a few plates from the Burnbeck Island competition. And to give you a flavour of how the book is laid out, I won't talk about these in any detail. The Manchester visit wasn't a waste of time. I continued on to Aberystwyth that evening, and next day interviewed Jonathan Vining at the Aberystwyth Arts Centre. This is a list of the 15 interviewees, and Jonathan and Alex Ely were two of the interviewees, along with a range of contributors, you know, some in the architectural world, some who were land agents, Crispin Kelly, a developer, clients, Jess Rayat and one or two others, landowners and so on. Jonathan, whom I interviewed at the Aberystwyth Arts Centre, where we were shortlisted to design creative industry work and live units. I collaborated with Jonathan and his office, White Young Green Cardiff, on two projects in the book, the Burnbeck Island competition and the redevelopment of Ben Goff's house care homes for Bristol charities. The book is interspersed with several short essays, including Collaborative Practice, reflecting on my pedagogical approach, first published in Domus in 2016, the Aspley Guys Patchwork City Association with Ian Abley and Alex Scragg, a proposal in response to the Wolfson Economic Prize 2016, which was an invitation to reimagine a garden city for the 21st century. And also a new suburban code for London, which proposes a bottom-up approach to the densification of suburbia, something we first explored with the Invisible House 30 years ago, and more recently in House plus Garden plus House with the back garden project for the Rayat family in Feltham, West London. This is a short photo essay or pages from the book by photographs by Seb Chew of the Rayat family in residence. It creates a kind of dynamic in the book so that there's not just a whole series of words and drawings. I feel all the drawings in this book are polemical in some way and try to address issues critical to the situation we find ourselves in today as architects. The book is not about the housing crisis. In the world we live in, there will always be a housing crisis. In preparing to write a review of the book for construction expert journal Moscow, Gleb Sobolov, who will be speaking shortly, asked me 3 questions, and I would like to conclude my presentation by reading out the questions and my responses. His first question was, what is the motivation behind making a book in the form of interviews? I replied that the book is a collage of images and texts, of which the interviews form only a part of the book. In the book, I'm attempting to document my architectural practice over the last 20 years using a range of different means. The interviews are an opportunity to engage with others directly or tangentially involved in the project, to discuss aspects of the project from a variety of viewpoints, including that of the layman, as well as experts from other disciplines. The interviews present conversations that are colloquial and wide-ranging, and I see them as an opportunity for the interviewee to speak in their own words. When Claire withdrew from the project, I felt compelled to continue with the interviews myself, and having asked each interviewee about their background and history, I felt I should write something about my own background as a way of declaring that the architectural project is an outcome of a great variety of considerations, some of which are barely acknowledged or understood even by the author. So, in talking about the introduction, I'm interested in the use of juxtaposition as a method, both in my design and writing, as well as teaching practice. The introduction to this book brings together a series of very short essays, which could have been arranged in a different order, some omitted, new ones added. In the book as a whole, I have attempted a dialogical approach in which the work unfolds on the basis of interaction between a range of different voices. I see the making of the book as an open-ended process aiming for the polyphonic and carnivalesque, as opposed to the monological, which constricts the presentation to a single authorial voice. Gleb, second question, are the laconic project graphics fundamental to your architectural thinking? And how does the project presentation correspond to the complex verbal concept description? I replied that the architect Mark Fisher, a friend now sadly dead, once commented that my architectural drawings were value-free. I took this on the chin and responded that I feel this is often the opinion of non-architects and the layman, who find the abstraction implicit in the architectural drawing difficult to read. I think the kind of drawings that I have made for the book, we have made for the book, are a distillation of the projects presented and expose the design to scrutiny without obfuscation. In making the drawing, there is a process of reduction in the culinary sense, so that at the point the drawing is ready, the lines reveal the essence of the project. This approach emerges from and comments on a long tradition in both Western and Oriental drawing. The method adopted is also overtly critical of the computer-generated image, which is the new lingua franca of architectural representation in mainstream media, but also used as a shorthand sometimes in architectural academia. Gleb's third question, has the experience of working on the book some resemblance with architectural practice? And if yes, has this experience helped you to clarify your architectural credo? I replied that I see making the book as a form of architectural practice. When we published Housey Housey, it was a deliberate attempt to frame our work on residential design in the tradition of the pattern book and look for similarities and differences in the work, something which is not possible when one is in the process of designing. Similarly, dwelling on the future is an opportunity to reflect on my architectural practice and declare the dilemma that architects have of conflicting agendas and responsibilities, moral, ethical, political, personal. By taking a long view on my practice over the last 20 years, it has enabled me to come to terms with my personal strengths and limitations, as well as reflecting on the struggle, opportunity of practicing architecture with a certain duty of care and responsibility, where the world, I feel, in a world where I feel the procurement of the environment is now almost completely corrupted and architecture increasingly marginalized. So just to conclude, this was the cover that we designed in the office, the unfolded cover. It was derived from this triptych. This is the Haywain by Bosch. It's in the Prado, and we couldn't afford to use this, but we sampled the panel. So it's an abstraction of the Haywain. In the Haywain, Bosch focuses on the sin of avarice, the desire for worldly gain. The left panel depicts the creation and fall of man, with the sea blue in the background. The right panel depicts the hellscape, red, of the city. The center panel focuses on a hay cart, gold, the symbol of greed, pride, and complacency, which leads to discord and violence. The hay cart is followed by men of all kinds plucking the hay, an allegorical reference that in the end it is Alhoi. And this is the cover of the dummy that we published ourselves in the office and handed over to UCL Press, and which was then transformed into the document you've all had access to via their website. So I'd like to now hand over to Georgia, who's in Tel Aviv, where she now lives and works, to speak about her experience of collaborating on the making of the book and about her interest in the potential ways architecture may be communicated in print and image. Thanks.
Thank you, Pierre.
Thanks, Pierre. Georgia, if you just share your screen, it will automatically flip over. There you go.
Great. So I joined Pierre's office in September 2017, and from the beginning, Dwelling on the Future took on a kind of major role in the function of the office. And like many of my colleagues who I know are streaming this around the world, I had the immense privilege of working with Pierre over the course of my year out before venturing on to my diploma studies. And this image, I'm sure many of you who have visited Pierre's office would find it familiar. And even when I kind of left the studio, I would kind of return every couple of months, and this kind of layering of the studio desk very much stood still, and maybe the books would slightly swap over, they would kind of accumulate in maybe a different way, but there was always this kind of stack of past and present. And when I talk of the book, I mean that not only in terms of it as an object, but also very much as a form of practice. And it was very much the kind of spirit of how we all engaged in and around the built and the unbuilt world. And Pierre's library also created a kind of ongoing network within London, reaching far beyond the walls of the studio in Durham Yard. And people would kind of come and leave with 1 or 2 books, and most of the meetings ended up huddled around the bookshelf in his library. And once a week, there was always kind of a package with something new. And so there was this kind of constant life of double books, absent books, old books, new books, but never forgotten books. And perhaps my kind of interest in the life of Pierre's library came because of an ongoing interest that I have had over the course of my studies in the practice of Seth Siegel, who was a kind of curator, and he was an art collector, and he, in his early career, actually worked in New York and then later in Amsterdam, where he has a very large archive held there. And in 1968, he started exploring this relationship between the form of the exhibition and printed matter in order to kind of question the space of the gallery within the marketplace, but also within new forms of art practice that were very much kind of emerging amongst his contemporaries at the time in New York. And this image is a mock-up of his Xerox book, which was an attempt to exhibit a group show. And this group show was made in the form of a bound book filled with photocopied works of art by 7 artists. Some of them were figures such as Carl Andre, Sol LeWitt, Lawrence Weiner, and every page of the book was actually made through the act of photocopying drawings and text and assemblage on the bed of a Xerox. So the artwork didn't exist beyond the pages of the book, and through this act of transfer and then subsequent ordering and binding and finally distribution and display, it becomes this kind of form of practice in itself. And Siegel's subsequent work continued to question, at least in my eyes, how the grouping of artwork arranged within the space of the exhibition were temporary through their association. And in effect, they could never exist in the same way without the support of the space of the gallery. And by inscribing an exhibition into a book, he is constantly collapsing the kind of physical world into its pages and almost freezing them and suspending them in their association with one another. And this is a kind of wonderful diagram by Clive Pilpott, who illustrates the kind of term of the artist book. And this term kind of more generally refers to publications that have been conceived as an artwork in their own right. And kind of provocations raised surrounding the form of the 1960s and 70s artist book seems even more relevant when talking about Dwelling on the Future and the role of bookmaking in architecture. As Dwelling on the Future features 12 unbuilt projects which don't exist beyond their pages, perhaps to take this further, the book becomes a kind of form of architectural practice in itself, or an architect's book. And the body of the book, or the materiality of the book, became this kind of important conversation around envisioning forms of practice in the office. And we all became interested in the architect's book as an artifact. And in this case, this is a kind of early attempt of self-publishing. Proposals for Iceland uses the transparency of pages to allow for projects to be overlaid over one another. And when you move through the book, it implies these notions of sequence and repetition and juxtaposition and duration, which are all architectural gestures and kind of concepts and ideas that were explored within the projects in their imagined form and then transferred into the artifact's production. So in his essay, The Book as an Object, Michel Boutour states that the sole but significant superiority not only of books but of all writing over the means of direct recording, which is incomparably more accurate, is the simultaneous exposure to our eyes and what our ears can only grasp sequentially. So the development of the book's form from table to tablet, from scroll to superimposed signatures, has always been orientated towards a greater emphasis of this feature. So understanding the book as a kind of form of practice or an idea of practice, it invites a kind of reflection on its priorities of the book's form through interviews and people and case studies and drawing and reference. They're all communicated through this kind of rubbing, this association of text and image, which we tried to look at in its form. And the form lends the book to its social qualities and possibilities by revealing and at times kind of curating and idealizing this juxtaposition through its pages. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgia. I'm going to go back to Pierre's suggested sequence of responses now. We have three guests who are going to lead discussion, following those that expansive presentation from Pierre, and then that terrifically engaging reflection from Georgia on the form and meaning of the book. So I'm going to start with Gleb Sobolov and then go on to Jos Bosman and finally Dean Hawkes. Gleb is a longtime friend and colleague of Pierre's. He's a practicing architect and a member of the Moscow Union of Architects. He teaches at the Moscow Architectural Institute and formerly at our sister organization, the Moscow Architectural School, which we refer to as March. He graduated from March and studied at the AA in London, and has for more than 4 years curated his own international educational project, Ruralities and Architecture and Context. So over to you, Gleb, for 5 to 10 minutes.
Yes, thank you. Good evening. And first of all, I would like to thank Pierre and London Met School of Architecture for inviting me to take part in this event. And one can rarely find in the books by modern architects more texts than images. Even less we find in those books opinions and thoughts of those who are involved in the projects in other than architects' roles. The book by Pierre is a very rare thing in this sense. Made with the participation of the anthropologist Claire Melhuish, this book can be called the anthropological study by the architect of his own works, which shows the intentions of actors and trains of events lying behind the architectural projects, and which are usually staying hidden from public. The second point, I believe, it is necessary to make that, in my opinion, the history of architecture and its trends of development can be understood as the survivalship bias, as we do not know which directions the architecture would have taken if other projects were chosen for construction. Taking into account modern requirements to project documentation, norms, and financial obligations, the architects of modern times are lacking even the opportunity to change, to enhance their own projects in the process of construction without losing their reputation and money. And coming back to the book and its specific character, I would like to mark that even this event in its form of storytelling can be seen as a live continuation of its content. We met with Pierre occasionally in London Underground train coach after the lecture I gave at CAS. The time on the way gave the opportunity to find common points of interest in architecture. Later, Pierre was invited by myself with a lecture and exhibition to Moscow as one of the participants of my long-running public project, Architecture and Context. This project is aimed to compensate the deficit of dialogue in Russian architectural field. The extracts from the book were presented in Moscow at the Dostoevsky Library by Pierre on this occasion in 2018. Later, Pierre took part in the Ruralities Summer School with my students in the village Itlar I am speaking from now. The texts of the book written by Pierre in many ways lay along with my thoughts on the problems of forming the architectural agenda in modern Russia and gives a stereoscopic picture which develops while reading the texts and interviews of very different people involved in the projects on all the stages. I think that's all. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very, very much, Gleb. Now we are going to hand over to Jos Bosman. Jos Bosman is Emeritus Professor in Architectural Design at Eindhoven University of Technology, where he was curator of Casa Vertigo. In the 1980s, he worked for the National Monuments Care Agency and subsequently as a researcher at the Institut für Geschichte und Theorie der Architektur, or GTA, of the ETH in Zurich. Jos, over to you.
Do you hear me?
We can hear you. Thank you. Go ahead. Oh, you're muted again. Perhaps you can unmute yourself.
So it's okay.
Now
yes.
We can hear you. Yes, we can't see you. Can you hit your camera and we can see you?
I can see myself.
Strange. We saw you earlier, but yes, now we can see you. Terrific.
Yes?
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. All right. I'm not so comfortable in reading, so I try to make a statement, digesting a little bit the impressions that we just saw. Normally, when we launch a book, I mean, here's the book, we congratulate the publishing house for doing an excellent job. And I think today we are a little bit modest in that direction because this is a very ambitious book. Georgia was explaining the kind of drive behind it, and Pierre was explaining the ambition. It's really about architectural design research. And actually the UCL Press is also a platform that is very ambitious because it wants to showcase the most prestigious architectural design research. So in principle, we are talking about a book that enlarges the scope of normal architectural design research. It wants to showcase it. And there are two things that Pierre already mentioned that I want to maybe start with, where in order to understand a little bit better where this is all about, because it's about a way of drawing. And I will come to the exhibition I made in Eindhoven on the work that explains that a little bit. The drawings are very specific, right? I mean, Pierre was saying that in making the drawing, there's a process of reduction. And I think all of you probably know the drawings of Pierre because you are listening, but let's see, I mean, here's an example in the dummy that Pierre made. We see a kind of drawing that is familiar as a kind of reduced drawing, and the way that I would recognize it in the early work of Oswald Matthias Ungers in the 1960s. Rem Koolhaas used it when he was teaching at the AA in the second half of the 1970s. And some people like Pierre really cultivated that way of drawing. He still is doing that. And probably Gropius in the Bauhaus already in the 1920s came with the isometric drawing as a specific tool. And in this book, that tool is combined with filling in the involvement in a very detailed way about those who are involved in preparing the project. So one thing is abstraction, reducing the complicated project to a simple drawing, as simple as possible. I mean, the notion of abstraction. And the other is, I would say, empathy, because you try to deal with people and the way they are involved, right? So we come to this title of Warringer's book, Abstraction and Empathy, which is, I think, a very interesting angle to understand this book. We are in the tradition of modernism, but in a tradition that is not heading for being as pragmatic as possible in the way that is the period of functionalism, but to go back a little bit to the sensibility in which this ambition is open to all the empathy drive of modernism as it started, being interested in foreign cultures, being interested in new ways of making, and etc. And now more in the anthropological way that that maybe came up in the period that Aldo van Eyck was interested in anthropology of Claude Lévi-Strauss and so on. So I think that's very interesting, these two things that come together. And I want to come back now to the way we tried to show that in Eindhoven, because in the book, in a very careful way, Pierre did already with his team lay out the text, right? So we have in proportion to the drawings, a lot of text. And in the exhibition, we made the drawings very big, as you saw on the photograph that Pierre showed. And I was reading all the text and I tried to scan the parts that would make you curious looking at the drawing, where the drawing is about and where the text is about. So there came some quotes, and in the exhibition they were halfway the ground and the table height. So there were texts that were big enough to read on that height. So they were floating a little bit in space, and for your eye, they were in between the ground and the very large drawing. And it should give you the appetite to go to the table, because on the table was the dummy with the chapter on the drawing. So that is the search for the interplay of drawings and textual analysis, intellectual design, ideas, and cultural insights. And what I say here, the end of that interplay, that's interestingly enough also in the introduction of UCL Press. They say that is their ambition. And yeah, I think I cannot skip this problem Pierre was struggling with, and also later developing it to the book that UCL Press made of it, is that this whole notion of interplay, like I explained with the exhibition, was very difficult to focus, and I could do it with the dummy. And I understand from the two comments of Pierre and Georgia that making a book is also not only a project, it's also part of the architectural design practice, the way the office works. So I think it's important to realize that in the dummy, there's an effort to make that interplay visible, not only, but also tangible as design. And the strange thing that happened is that UCL Press, for some reason, thought the dummy should change into something else. So they changed it into a very different graphical design version, in which the letter type changed, in which the size of the letter changed, in which instead of one column, there are two columns. And I say that because I think otherwise one doesn't understand that if you order this copy or if you download it, you get something very different from what Pierre and his team made in the book. So when we talk about this interplay, I think there's a good reason to compare the two. Because in the version that is original, the interplay works much better, in my opinion. I mean, I could work with that and I see the attention. And in the UCL Press version, it falls apart a bit. And I think it's an important thing to say, especially to towards the press that is has a big ambition to deal with this topic. Do I have still some minutes?
Yes, sure, go ahead. We're a little ahead of time, funnily enough. Okay,
good. So that's the point I wanted to make about the book. And then a little bit about the kind of attitude behind it. Pierre was saying a lot of things, and I think it's good to highlight two of them. One is that he talks about the bottom-up approach, and he mentions, the wish to advocate government legislation that is, again, a little bit more sensitive to housing. But we are living in a period that this is often difficult in different countries. But still, the reason behind that is to enable individuals and small groups to obtain land at affordable costs on which to build homes for themselves without being priced out of the market. And that attitude brings me and Pierre together at the moment in a platform we are building together with two colleagues. Do you mind, Pierre, that I mention that now? Because
no, not at all. Yours, please. Yes, fine.
To do that, to self-building, like Walter Siegel did in the 1970s in London, to instruct as an architect those who want to have a lower priced building because they involve their own time. And it needs an instruction from the architect how to do that. And Pierre and myself, together with Björn Martensen from Aachen, Björn is a little bit also the other angle from what Pierre is saying. When he made the housing exhibition, Pierre worked with adapted second-hand tables and working with things you find and as a way to build cheaper is something that is also one way to create that, to make that agenda possible in reality of making affordable houses. And I think Pierre and myself, we are already talking now over a year, and slowly we are starting this new kind of platform that, Pierre is a couple of years older than myself, and we have some architects that are younger than us. And I think it's interesting I think what this Pierre is doing in the book, there's this agenda, and now we are in a time period in which we have to reinvent practice in order to realize it also. And that's a kind of second point I want to make. I think that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jos. In fact, you did break up a little bit there when you were introducing this platform that you're talking about, but I think we got the gist of it in the end, and we can always come back to it in questions if there's...
The name, it is Comme de l'Architecture.
Okay.
So it's sort of like Comme des Garçons, but then in...
Superb.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, so now a final comment, some final feedback before we go to open the questions to the floor. We have Dean Hawkes joining us. Dean Hawkes is, forgive me, Dean, for saying so, but Dean Hawkes is, to me anyway, something of a living legend in architecture, certainly in architectural academia. I've known Dean since my first year, many years ago at architecture school, and he has won many awards for architectural education and been recognized for his huge contribution, especially to environmental design. His books contribute, and his lectures have done so as well, to thinking about making better buildings from the point of view of the climate and the wider climate change and resource scarcity concerns that are at the forefront of much of our thinking today. But particularly his last book actually for me touches a really significant point in architecture, which is to think not only about the environment and our environmental design issues in terms of how we make buildings better, but also how we consider the environment in terms of imagining architecture. So over to you, Dean, for your feedback or for your response to Pierre's presentation. Thank you.
Well, Matthew, thank you for those very kind words. I'm delighted to have been invited to contribute to this occasion. Pierre and I have been friends for many years. I mean, I think we've had a number of architectural adventures together over these years. So I was very pleased when I had the opportunity in the autumn of last year to review the book. And I wrote a review in the open access journal called Buildings and Cities. And like others, I have the book, and I'd like to show this to everyone, which is a much prized part of my library, as you can see behind me. Now, what I'm going to do, having been enlisted at the last moment, is just to paraphrase one or two points that I made in my review. The first thing that struck me very forcibly in my first engagement with the book was that the series that it's in from UCL Press, which is in the series Design Research in Architecture. And this is a question which I've been long interested in the attitude that exists in some areas of academic architecture, that one can practice architecture and one can research architecture, but practice is not research and research is not practice. So I'm very interested in encountering a book in a series called Design Research in Architecture. I believe absolutely profoundly that design is and can be research, with a number of provisos, but how one actually precisely distinguishes between that practice, that design practice, which is ordinary, and that which is special, and therefore in some way constitutes research. It seems to me that this book is a wonderful example of just that. And that's something which I tried to emphasize in the review that I wrote. It seemed to me that the crucial element of the book, which transforms it from a kind of account of practice into practice as research, lies in the combination of representations of architectural projects in the beautiful line drawings which others have referred to, and the text, the results from the interviews that Pierre listed in his presentation. And it seemed to me that there's this combination, this critical narrative between image and word that invests the project with its research content. I particularly loved the summation of that from Pierre in his presentation of it being process as well as outcome. I think that's a beautiful phrase. A couple of two other points I really want to make. One is just an aside that struck me reading the book, and in the categories of seaside, Middle England, and metropolis. And I made a comment in my review that only one of the 4 seaside projects is actually at the sea. It's actually in the sea at Weston-super-Mare. But it reminded me of a statement made about England by James Turrell, who about 20 years ago had a residence at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park in the north of England. Yorkshire Sculpture Park is about as far as possible as you can get from the sea in England. It's in the middle of the island, midway between, on the west side, the Irish Sea, and on the east side, the North Sea. And Turrell, having lived there for, I think, 6 months of his residency, during which he made a wonderful sky space. But at the end of that, and reflecting on it, he wrote, "You realize that England is at sea." So, no, in spite of Pierre's categorization of seaside, Middle England, and metropolis, I think we English are always at sea, not in the metaphorical sense of being confused, but the nature of our environment is actually in some ways always related to the sea. That's a digression. The last thing I really want to say is coming back to something about the nature of the book and placing it in a wider context. And in his conclusion, Pierre compares his journey with that described by the English writer and novelist J.B. Priestley in his book, English Journey, published in 1934. A book which was conceived in a very great tradition of English writing, which begins with William Cobbett's Rural Rides from 1822, 1826, and I will hold up my copy of this wonderful book to link Pierre to that. And the other immediate parallel to this, to add to the collection, is just a few years after Priestley was George Orwell wrote to Wigan Pier, this wonderful book, published in 1937. So we have this wonderful tradition of journeys in England. And in my review, I concluded by mentioning this other one, specifically architectural journey, which I hope some of you know, this marvelous document by Alison Smithson called AS in DS. Alison's initials, of course, and DS refers to the Smithson's DS Citroën car, in which they journeyed around England. And the book consists, if I can do as Josh did, I can find some page. The book is in the shape of the car, incidentally, which makes it very difficult to put on your shelves. But on the inside cover, you actually get the plan of the car. And the book consists of description of journeys with sketches made by Alison from the front seat, and with rather wonderful, slightly out of focus photographs by Peter, mainly also taken through the windscreen, I think when the car was stationary. So a wonderful kind of context within which Pierre's book also takes its place in this great tradition of the English journey, and specifically the architectural one. Just to come back to the question of design as research, it does seem to me that the book really is an important contribution to the demonstration that design can be research, and the projects individually and in some are valuable demonstrations of housing possibilities in the 20th century, way beyond the normal presentations that we get from so-called standard housing literature. So Pierre, thank you again for the book, and that's all I want to contribute at this point. Thank you.
Terrific, thank you so much, Dean. All right, so I think we are going to take questions from the floor. Before I do that, I'm going to hand back to Pierre to pick up on any of the points that Gleb, Jos or Dean made and respond to any of them that you want to straight away. But just before I hand back to Pierre, I'd like to say that if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please use the put your hand up function, because it means I can come to you directly. You should be able to see somewhere on your app, depending on what form you have, 3 little dots. I think to the left of it, for most of you, you'll see a little smiley face with a hand doing that. If you hover over that, you'll see a yellow hand, and if you press on the hand, it will illuminate you, and I will straight away be able to see that you would like to speak. So if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please put your hand up using that button. Okay, Pierre, over to you.
Okay, well, thanks, Matthew. Really to start by thanking Georgia, Gleb, Jos, and Dean for joining in and contributing. There's nothing I want to particularly pick up, except to say, I suppose one of the critical things for me in the book is that I say it at the end, and it's a bit of a rant, that all architecture is political, and I comment in my introduction about I talk about Bernard Tschumi's book Architecture and Disjunction. I talk about Venturi in Complexity and Contradiction. I just wanted to mention, that I also speak about Richard Hamilton, the artist, and he discusses the dilemma of engagement and subversion, and that dilemma was to invoke, I write this, I'm reading this out, the Duchampian notion of an ironism of affirmation that allowed for critique and celebration, distance and engagement to be present at one and the same time. And I suppose my position now is that, I think that kind of idea was something that was, relevant in the kind of post-war euphoria around consumerism. And I think we've gone so far now to a point where I think we can't take a distance. We have to engage with the situation. And part of the writing in the book has a sort of, I think it almost a naive, dumb quality to want to invoke that notion that we have to engage. Otherwise we just get steamrolled. But yeah.
Thank you, Pierre. I would just like to pick up on this issue that I think that you said rant there, and I remember, in fact, when I came over to your office, it must have been December, almost over a year ago, and we had a long chat about this book and another book that you have been working on. You talked about your ambitions for the book, and I quite flippantly said something along the lines of course, books don't really have very much of a future. Everything's going online now. And you were very affronted by this and sort of made the point that the book is a thing in itself, as well as a particular approach. And of course, the way we engage with the book now is both as an online download. Sometimes we read on our phones, but in a way, one of the things about the journey that Dean talked about, which has also been, as you said, a struggle, and has a kind of reciprocity between being one thing and also another, is maybe it has become more complex and more like architecture. And I very much like that phrase that Claire cites and comes back to in her preface to the book, where she talks about the impure medium of architecture. Of course, the book was not the book that you wanted it to be, but do you think perhaps in the variety of its formats and the range of conversations and arguments that it raises, maybe it has become more than the book you originally intended?
Yeah, I think, that has to be, I have to say yes to that, because I think it in a kind of open-ended scenario that I kind of really positively believe in, I think, there's a point at which you hand over, and we have that issue within the architectural project, building project, where you do hand over to the client, and the client, the building has a far longer life out of your hands than in your hands. Yeah, but I suppose so. I mean, I'm frustrated by the way that UCL Press have taken it on, and my argument with that is that it's design research, as it's conducted in academia, the outcome is the artifact of the book, and there should be some greater liberty for the author to be able to play with that, so that the kind of strictures of controlling the kind of output in terms of format, etc., is problematic. It is a problematic, and it'd be interesting to know what other people who are listening in think about that. If there's a kind of struggle there.
So I'd like to invite our guests and colleagues. Also, please do send me a signal, put your hand up if you have a question you'd like to address. We certainly at London Met at the School of Art, Architecture and Design we've just recently completed our REF return, our return for the Research Excellence Framework, and many of us have been engaging very actively at this threshold between research and practice, and looking at how practice can be framed as research. So it's something we've keenly been involved in. I wonder if one of our colleagues, maybe Nick or Sandra, would like to comment on this or ask a question in relation to it. Okay, Nick, yes, please go ahead.
First of all, I just wanted to say how much I really enjoyed the presentation and the speakers. I thought generally it was a really interesting, insightful, thought-provoking presentation. I'm sorry I haven't read the book yet, but I will definitely read it. But I've got a question really about, Pierre, about your particular perspective, if you like, about the state of the profession in the context of the built environment generally, because in a way you do paint a slightly pessimistic or troubling picture of the situation that we all face as educators and researchers. But in a way, I was interested in how you use the book as the vehicle for conveying that concern, in a sense, by which I mean that you explore your buildings very much in terms of this question of land, of situating the building within a context, the importance of siting the building almost as a way of, of counteracting the kind of autonomy of architecture as objects in a landscape. But then how the book itself is a kind of narrative that weaves interviews, descriptions and drawings into a body of work, which is then presented on the front cover by a kind of abstraction of Bosch's triptych, where we have presented here the shift between obviously hell and purgatory and hopefully into the realm of heaven, and the way in which the abstraction becomes a kind of statement almost about architecture itself. And I'm kind of interested in that. I was really intrigued by how you arrived at that, when you complete the work itself and the dummy copy that you describe, which I think, obviously the disappointment that UCL Press didn't really take that on board properly in the final work. But I think Dean's point about it being a journey, and the wrapping, the cover itself becomes a kind of expression, almost as a work of art itself, I suppose, as a kind of iconography of the book and its content. So I'm just really interested in that. Obviously, there's a rich tradition of architects thinking about their buildings as books or as constructs, like writing, and it's something that it's really close to my own views about architecture. But I'd be interested in your interpretation of that in the context of the journey that you've taken in making the work.
Sure. I mean, it's thank you, Nick, for the comments. I think I am pessimistic, but about the state of architecture, not just in this country. I think wherever I travel, I mean, I see things that don't necessarily please me, and it's not just the ocular. But I suppose I sort of putting that to a side, the invitation to make the book was something that I embraced. I've always been interested in the writing around architecture and just in books generally, but the invitation to make the book was very I embraced that as an opportunity to sort of speculate around my own situation. And I suppose I'm kind of interested in the elements that come together in the making of the project, and in a fairly straightforward way, acknowledging the contribution of everything that exists, so that architecture can be very ordinary and it can be heroic at the same time, so I wanted to lay it out in a way without, I suppose, perhaps in an unacademic way. You know, Claire and I have had this discussion, you know, about reflecting on what the outcome of the interviews, or what I feel was being said. And I feel like by placing these elements together in the context of the book and juxtaposing them in such a way that, you know, it allows certain kinds of readings to be made. And I think that was really all I was interested in doing. And by doing that, it offers the reader, you know, a kind of opportunity to reflect on their own condition, and you know, it's personal. It became a very personal kind of development of the project, and you know, and yeah, I don't know what I think this idea, I mean, about the way we as architects have to respond, you know, I mean, we have to be optimists to make buildings, to make environments, and you know, that's an element of my practice, you know, and but just in the context in which one operates, it becomes a dilemma as to how one can achieve a certain level of quality, you know, that truly benefits us all.
Thank you, Pierre. That's a very interesting response. I think that idea of a dilemma. I mean, I'm just reminded of the book title you had up earlier from Clifford. That word predicament also comes to mind. But I think also the sense in which this book is faithful to the topic and also faithful to your mode of engagement as an architect. So, but at the same time, moving between these different ways of engaging that one has to as an architect in the topic. I know that Sandra has something she's thinking about, so I'm going to hand over to Sandra to ask a question or address her comments to you.
Right, thank you, Matthew, and thanks for presenting this great work. I'm also really intrigued by the cover, but my question is slightly different. Pierre, you said reflecting on one's own condition, and I'm just thinking of our own condition at the moment in terms of a pandemic, being quite isolated at home, and really wondering if, you know, this kind of very deep and dense contribution which you have on housing and home, isn't that, you know, even more important at the moment? Yeah, we all, you know, stuck at home, and probably everybody has explored their neighborhoods much more than before. I mean, I got to know lots of things I didn't know that are really close to my home. So it's really, isn't this really important nowadays, also in the context of a pandemic maybe, and working from home? And maybe just a suggestion in terms of, you know, the way you are an architect and you're a researcher, but I think you're also an educator. And yes, particularly with this book, you know, I don't know, but I always, if I have something to give to others as kind of education, maybe that's something quite positive, and maybe that adds a kind of positiveness to the conversation and this book as well. So it's maybe it's more a comment than a question, really.
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. I mean, I suppose just what comes to mind in the making of things and in the way we present ourselves in the world, it's just always the level of artifice involved, and I suppose that's, you know, we can't deny that. So I see the book has this, you know, despite oneself wanting to be authentic necessarily, there's a level of artifice about it, and you know, it's something that I've authored, and with some very a small group of very intimately involved collaborators in making it, but and you know, I see, you know, there's a certain level of privilege to be able to say these things, you know, whether they, you know, however lucid and well put they are, but you know, so I mean, I do see myself in a position of privilege in this world, you know, and I suppose, you know, that's one of the issues we have in architecture education is, you know, who can engage with that. And I suppose part of what you're saying is partly to do with who, you know, is architectural education becoming more of a privileged kind of agenda again, you know, because of the way the world has been changing. Yeah,
I think so.
Thank you, Pierre. I mean, I think that Sandra's question, which had a sort of hinted that there are reasons to be optimistic as well from the educational point of view, comes back to that very authentic and lovely picture that Georgia was painting of what it's like in your office as this bigger context, this wider context, not just for education, but for a kind of living with architecture that might feel a bit like apprenticeship, but very much a place in which the culture of architecture is broadened and is very kind of humanized. Since we don't have very long left, I'm going to suggest that what we do now is go to Georgia, maybe have a couple of final comments, and then to Gleb, and then to Jos, and then to Dean if he has any final comments before coming back to give you the last word, Pierre. So Georgia, would you like to add anything or make any comments based on the event as a whole?
Sure. I think just kind of replying to what you just said, Matthew, I think that, and I know that Amy and Tamir are in the audience somewhere, but there was this kind of wonderful thing with the book that not only was the book in its content, this kind of cross-section of ideas and people and things of the past that were brought forward and recontextualized, and kind of there were kind of these wonderful moments of slippage which happened in its content, but there was also this wonderful thing that whoever was working on the book, and this book has run through many people's hands, there was this great acknowledgement of Pierre that we could kind of superimpose our kind of understanding, or how the book was relevant to the things in which we were interested in privately, and the things that we discovered through working with Pierre. So I think there's also, and I guess I tried to talk about that in the presentation, this kind of back end to the book that was kind of echoed actually what the book was trying to do overtly. And so again, I think this idea of the double comes through there, which is an amazing thing. And hopefully the dummy comes to life once again. But yeah, thanks so much. It was so nice sharing that.
That's great. Thank you, Georgia. Gleb, any final words from you?
Yes, I would like to say that first of all, I think this book is very interesting for the Russian public, because it's a very unusual point of view, and also of the view on architecture and on the architectural processes, because here most of the students are learning or studying using the magazines as the examples of architecture, and they are not mainly, the educational system is built in such a way that the discussion is not open at all. The students just have to fulfill certain requirements. And in this sense, also, this book shows not an egoistic architectural view, but the view of architecture as a common thing. And I always recall the legend of Babel Tower, because when the construction was the common deed, and the way to actually to stop it was just to break the dialogue, because even speaking the same language, we do not understand each other. So, and in this way, this book shows this dialogue and this, as I said, this stereoscopic view of the architectural process. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That's terrific. Jos, are you still with us? Jos Bosman.
Yes.
There he is. Hi.
Hi. Yes, I think in the end, Sandra was mentioning that the point of the educator in the book becomes very much a new dimension, I think, with this book, because we know, probably all of you, Housey, which already is a book that documents the projects very carefully. And it's the same tradition of drawing that is in this book. I mentioned that, I mentioned a couple of names, but I think Pierre is one of the few architects that, for the students, keeps the tradition of drawing in a way that you can always experience that drawing as a didactic instrument. I mean, for my students, I always use that because it's very clear, a clear way of drawing that it looks so easy, but if you compare it with those of others and how drawing is nowadays reduced to, you know, Photoshop and techniques that avoid that precision. I think it's interesting in this book that the new dimension is now that all these people that are involved tell their personal story and background. And that also as a student, you get the feeling that being involved as you are plays a role in that domain, how also when you probably don't know immediately how that works. And the books gives a hint of that the way you live your life, have a background, come together with somebody else, that all of that becomes part of what we call architectural culture, that it gets a role into that. And it's not easy to digest immediately. And of course, there's a kind of pessimistic perspective here because all these projects are not realized, which is a little bit strange, of course, but it doesn't matter because it is something on the road to think and produce architectural thinking, drawing, conversation, and so on. So I think that's the point here. That's the thing that comes in the end as an important result.
Thank you, Jos. Yeah, no, I think also your earlier observation, your reference to the reciprocity between abstraction and empathy was also nicely observed with regard to this point as well. Dean, would you like to make any final comments or points?
Am I on? Yes.
Yes, you are.
Thank you, Matthew. This is a thought that was very much prompted by what Pierre said in response to Sandra's observations. I spoke about practice as research, and Pierre made the absolutely crucial point about the third point of the triangle, which of course is teaching. And it seems to me that of course probably the greatest value of this book becomes as a resource for teaching. And I was very much impressed by the comment by Gleb about students looking at magazines. They should look at books like this. This is so important. That's why I think it's such a really important contribution.
Great. Yeah, no, I think that's a point that's come over quite strongly this evening. Thank you for that, Dean. Okay, and I'm going to give the last word before we say goodbye to Pierre. Pierre, would you like to make any final comments?
Yes, I would, Matthew. I mean, two things really to say. Well, I mean, one is to say thank you to everybody who's attended today. I can see some familiar faces of friends on screen, but I can't read initials, but just everybody who's come. It's really wonderful that you've joined in. It's been you know, really great. And I wanted also to say that the interviewing process, all the people who sort of submitted themselves to my interviewing technique, you know, well, all of them, you know, are well known to me, but all of them did the interview without knowing how the interview was going to be set in the book. And that's, I realize more and more, you know, that's quite an open kind of situation. People, you know, people can be quite vulnerable in doing that. And I just hope I've done them justice, and I, you know, haven't taken advantage of that process. And I feel that, you know, I've found it incredibly enriching to not just having done the interviews, but then to have Bryony transcribe them. You know, they were very long and I've had to edit them. But that process was also very long, but in kind of trying to get to the nub of what people were saying and give them enough space. You know, each one of these interviews is still 5,000 words in the book. They're quite long, and it gives people time to stretch out and say a whole range of things. And you know, I think that for me is the thing that most enriches the book. So thank you to all of the interviewees. Couldn't have happened without them. Yeah, and thanks again to all my collaborators on this. There's been some fantastic contributions. Thank you, and thank you everyone. Yeah, Matthew and Nick and Christian and Sandra.
Good. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pierre. I'd like to say that this is the last of our AAD sessions for this academic year. We do still have a couple of events coming up. This Thursday, in fact, we have a meeting of the Interdisciplinary Research Forum. And if you'd like to find out more about that, please do visit the Research Centre's web pages at London Met. If you go to London Met and go to the research pages and follow through to the Centres of Research, our research centre is called CUBE, Centre for Urban and Built Ecologies. And you're very welcome to follow us and join any of our events going forwards. Pierre, it's been great to have you tonight, presenting tonight. And I should also add that this event is part of a conversation that Sandra and I have been having with Pierre for some time. So just to say thanks to Sandra also for pushing for the event. It's been great to also unfold the event so that we have, in addition to Pierre, contributions from Georgia, Hablützel, Gleb Sobolov, Bosman, and Dean Hawkes tonight. So thank you all very much. We are going to close this session now. So goodbye.